In this third session, we ask, how do I structure my argument? And this third session is closely related to the second session on reasoning, but I really want to make the distinction between the two maximally clear. Reasoning in front of an audience and presenting an argument to an audience are two different things. And when we speak of argumentation, I really want to emphasize the choice situations that you as a researcher will encounter. Not just when you ask questions such as what topic should I do research on, but also understand that choices permeate the methodological aspects of what we do as well, our reasoning and argumentation. And that's what the thesis for today echoes as well. This is from an article I co-authored with Saku Mantere. We wrote, the choices researchers make are not limited to matters of policy and preference, such as choosing a specific research topic, but also choices in how we reason from empirical data to theoretical conclusions. Understanding these choices is crucial in peer review in particular. We'll talk about peer review in session number 4. In this session, I'll talk mostly about the formulation of arguments and their evaluation in the methodological sense. Here are the materials I'm citing in this session. I'm using a couple of examples in this session. And the more prominent one that I'll be using is the example on arguments about economic inequality. So these materials reflect that. And again, I have indicated in boldface the materials that I will be drawing upon more extensively. And again, let me remind you that if you take a look at this material, do not read it as prescription or guidance. Read it as food for thought. Something that may help you develop your own position on argumentation. I am going to start this session with an example, and this example comes from the research on economic inequality, most notably Thomas Piketty's 2014 book, Capital in the 21st Century. I am going to discuss one of the claims that Piketty makes in this 700-page book, and then I will show the structure of an argument that supports this claim. And the claim is as follows. This is what Piketty labeled the central contradiction of capitalism. A market economy based on private property, if left to itself, contains powerful forces of convergence, associated in particular with the diffusion of knowledge and skills. But it also contains powerful forces of divergence, which are potentially threatening to democratic societies and to the values of social justice on which they are based. My prediction is that as I was reading this claim, you already started evaluating it. You may have had a visceral reaction that made you either agree or disagree with this claim. I'm just going to put it bluntly and say, the scholar's task is to systematically resist the visceral reaction. This is not about what you believe in. Whether you agree with this claim or not is completely irrelevant. What is relevant is, for you as a scholar, if you want to evaluate this claim, you need to look at more than just a claim. You need to look at the entire argument structure that is offered in support of this claim. And for that, unless you have read Piketty's book cover to cover, you really should refrain from passing judgment. This is the scholar's duty. Not to be compelled by predispositions. Your task is to evaluate the credibility of the claim. And for that to be possible, you have to look at the structure of the argument in its entirety. This is just a claim that's being made. And yes, the claim is a part of the argument, but there are many other elements as well. And we need to understand what those elements are, and then we need to understand in what way that entire structure supports this specific claim. My colleagues Sebastian Voss, Peter Kowalik, and I looked at the argument in Piketty 2014, and we analyzed its structure by applying Stephen Toulmin's 1958 model of argument structure, something that I have found very useful in trying to map the structure of an argument. And let me start with the key claim, the central contradiction of capitalism. That seems like a logical starting point. If we look at the central contradiction of capitalism, we actually see two distinct but related claims. One is a claim of convergence. The other is a claim of divergence. We decided that we would analyze only the divergence claim. It seems like every individual claim has to be analyzed separately to see what kind of an argument structure supports that specific claim. So, what we call the divergence claim can be restated from the central contradiction of capitalism as follows. A market economy based on private property, if left to itself, contains powerful forces of divergence that constitute potential threats to democracy and social justice. I have a couple words there in italics. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. So this is the key claim. But now imagine Piketty sitting around a table of economic inequality researchers, and let's assume he utters this claim. The obvious questions from around the table are going to be, oh, what's that based on? How do you justify this claim? So, Piketty's book is actually based on empirical material. He looks at tax records and conducts a number of empirical analyses. So one of the things we would need to understand is what kinds of empirical material does he use? What kinds of empirical inferences does he use? And how do these inferences support the claim? So let's start adding material to this page. In our analysis, we concluded that there are four central things. And as you can see, these are not data points, these are inferences. So these are mainly inductive, enumerative inductive inferences drawn from the empirical raw data that we thought Piketty needs to justify the claim. There are two letters in the first box, R and G. R is the return on capital. So let's say that you invest in something. So the return on your investment that you get, that's R. And G is the growth rate of the economy. Now, Piketty focused largely on returns to private capital. And he noted that in light of historical fact, R has persistently exceeded G. That returns to private capital accrue at a faster pace than economies grow. Another thing he observed was an increasing concentration of wealth. He looked at the income distribution and wealth distribution and looked at the concentration of wealth and income in the top 1%, top 0.1%. Kind of depending on the context, he would look at different parts of the upper tail. But he saw increasing concentration there. Again, an empirical generalization. Then he used the label patrimonial capitalism simply to apply to the phenomenon that the fraction of wealth controlled by private interests has increased over time. He called it patrimonial capitalism. And finally, he made notice of the increasing executive compensation. C-suite executives in publicly traded corporations would just not only make large amounts of money, but also their incomes have risen faster than in any other income category. And he called this, again, an empirical phenomenon. He called it the rise of super salaries. So these are the four central empirical elements that Piketty needs to get to the claim. But these are obviously not sufficient conditions. So these are just empirical generalizations. How could we, from these, conclude powerful forces of divergence that constitute threats to democracy? No, we're just looking at tax records here. But we need something more. And let me add that something more in the middle here. And our reading of Piketty is that there are three things that he needs, and they kind of elaborate or complement the empirical material, but they are not empirical material themselves. Piketty calls R being greater than G a fundamental inequality, that there's something profoundly important about it. But again, just by looking at the tax records and income records and estate records, there's really no empirical grounds for labeling R greater than G a fundamental inequality. And also, while the question whether R persistently exceeds G is an empirical question, the question is R sufficiently greater than G. That's no longer an empirical question, or it could be turned into one. But Piketty doesn't treat this as an empirical question. He seems to assume that R is sufficiently greater than G. Finally, the rise of super salaries. Yes, executive compensation has increased, but a central part of Piketty's argument is this idea that the concentration of wealth and income and the rise of super salaries occur in ways that are undeserved. That executives do not deserve the compensation that they receive. So here it's more than just about the amount. It's about the process by which the compensation is determined. As you may know, the CEO's salary is determined by the board of directors, its compensation committee, which in publicly traded companies has to be independent of the corporation and its shareholders. And it has to be independent of the CEO as well. So the idea is that if the compensation committee is independent, uses its independent judgment to serve the best interest of the corporation, then even if it awards the CEO a compensation package that seems exorbitant to the outside observer, it's not necessarily undeserved. So we can't just look at the level of executive compensation and conclude that it's undeserved. We'd have to dig deeper. Well, Piketty doesn't dig deeper empirically in his book. And that's why this notion that the wealth accumulates in undeserved ways is essentially an assumption. An assumption that he then applies to the rise of super salaries to infer something else. So the white boxes are empirical inferences. In the case of statistical research, enumerative inductions. But the dark gray boxes here, they're more assumptions, predispositions, principles that have to be justified somehow. Well, how do we justify the dark gray boxes? This presents the question, well, what's the fundamental intellectual foundation of what you're doing? What gives you the license to label R being greater than G a fundamental inequality? What gives you the license to infer that R is sufficiently greater than G even if you don't show it empirically? And what gives you the license to state that wealth accumulates in undeserved ways when you haven't empirically demonstrated this undeservedness? Well, there are three things that we found that we inferred. Again, this is part of our own sense-making process. Piketty didn't show this structure. We inferred the structure from his text. We concluded that Piketty needs three things as the foundation. One is the idea that economic inequality is a topic, a phenomenon that's somehow subject to general laws, such as R being greater than G. Second, there are very obvious both implicit and explicit links to Rawls's theory of justice, and specifically his difference principle. And finally, this idea that wealth accumulates in undeserved ways, it's based on this idea that managers are not just powerful. I mean, we know that executives are powerful, but the idea that an executive in setting their compensation succeeds in exerting pressure on the independent board compensation committee to effectively set his or her own salary, that's beyond managerial power. That's hegemony. And indeed, there is a conversation on managerial hegemony in the research literature. So these are the foundational pillars on which the gray boxes that ultimately help Piketty bridge the empirical material with the claim rest. Now finally, let me add labels to these boxes. On the bottom right in the light gray box, we have the claim, and the italicized words are qualifiers. They are adverbs, adverbial statements, or just short passages that somehow qualify a market economy if left to itself. There's a qualifier. Potential threat, that's another qualifier. Qualifiers are central parts of the claim. We need to understand and be explicit about the strength at which the claim is being asserted. And Piketty himself was very clear that no empirical material can afford definitive statements about economic inequality, and that's why the qualifiers are absolutely essential. On the left in the white boxes are what Stephen Toulmin called grounds, and in empirically based research, we can think of the grounds as empirical material. Not empirical data, and definitely not raw data, but inferences drawn, often inductive inferences drawn from the data. So we concluded that Piketty needs at least these four central inductive inferences to be able to make the claim. In between the grounds and the claim are warrants, which essentially, and he used the word license. I like that as a metaphor. The warrants are statements, principles, and such assumptions that give the author of the argument the license to go from the grounds to the claim. And I think that the notion of license is most conspicuous when we look at the R minus G. The idea of R persistently exceeds G is ultimately interpreted as R is sufficiently greater than G to produce the kinds of adverse consequences that Piketty envisioned. And indeed, there's something fundamental about the inequality of R being greater than G. But these warrants, which are here applied in a specific case, they rest on a number of backings. So this is kind of the bedrock of the argument, the intellectual foundation. The notion that economic inequality is subject to general laws, Rawls's difference principle, and the notion of managerial hegemony, they give Piketty kind of the ultimate justification for using the warrants that he does. And this is where I want to highlight choice. There are many choice situations that you face in terms of framing the claim, what kinds of qualifiers to use, what kinds of empirical material to include and exclude. And then what kinds of warrants to choose. And I'll come back to the choice of warrants later in this session. I really want to make it transparent and understandable that we face in our reasoning and in our argumentation, we face situations in which we have to make a choice, and that choice may have far-reaching consequences in terms of what kind of a claim will ultimately emerge. So this is the Toulmin model that my colleagues and I applied to Piketty 2014. We identified a claim, grounds, warrants, and backings. We had to read the entire book, cover to cover, to be able to uncover. Or maybe uncover is the wrong word here. This is really the result of our own sense-making process. If you did the same exercise, let's say that you took the same claim and the same qualifiers, we gave you the book and said, go and do the analysis. Would you come up with the same grounds, warrants, and backings? Maybe, maybe not. So this is really an abductive reasoning process by which we inferred the argument structure. So we're not presenting this as a mapping, or the mapping must be understood as the result of our sense-making process. This is how we understood the structure of the argument that supported Piketty's divergence claim. Let me make a number of more general observations at this point and present you with questions that I would like you to think about as you're thinking about your argument, presenting it, and then, of course, evaluating the arguments of others. And I'm going to keep referencing the Piketty example. There's a couple more things that I'd like to mention, and there are also a couple of things that really nicely illustrate some of the follow-up questions that I'm asking here. If we look at the structure of the argument, we can't really see the process by which the argument was built. Where did the researchers start? They started the backings, the warrants, the grounds, or the claim. There's really no general rule here, nor prescription. Some of us start at the intellectual foundations, at the first principles, if you will. So some of us start our argument formulation from the backings. Others like to be more empirical and maybe look at empirical data, so they may be more likely to start at the grounds. Yet others may have some rudimentary claim that they'd like to elaborate and look more into and maybe add qualifiers. So we may start at different places. I'd like you to be conscious of where you start. And then if you can, make it explicit. Make it explicit to your audience. Again, there's really no general rule here, but transparency is always useful. Now, in terms of evaluating an argument, I usually start at the claim. So let's say that I'm reading an empirical research article for the first time. The first thing I'm looking for is the key claim. And sometimes I just can't find it. I'd like to see it in the abstract, certainly in the introduction, and then repeat it in the conclusion very clearly. To me, claims tend to be short statements, one sentence, two sentences, where you crystallize the central claim of your work. Make that explicit. So when I evaluate claims, when I evaluate arguments, I start at the claim. Then I usually move to the grounds, and then I ask, okay, what are the warrants, and then what are the backings? And a lot of these in research articles are only implicit. And this was certainly true in the Piketty analysis as well. What you see here on this page is not something that Piketty showed. This is our sense-making, the result of our sense-making process. What do we think Piketty needs to get from his grounds to his claim? And for this, in addition to understanding the structure of the argument, it would help immensely if we could also understand the process of constructing the argument. Well, no matter what the process, At some point, you have to formulate a claim. Again, make it explicitly. Make sure that your reader will find it, maybe twice, first in the introduction, then in the conclusion. Piketty was very clear that there were important qualifiers and no grounds could support the claim alone. This links back to the idea of not overplaying your hand. If you don't insert qualifiers, then you're very likely overplaying your hand. You're making an unconditional statement when you should be making a conditional one. But there is also the other option that you underplay your hand. Sometimes I see claims that use the word may 2 or 3 times. This may lead to this, which may in turn lead to this. If you add this may, it really waters down the claim altogether because you end up essentially saying nothing. If you just add conditions. So make sure that you neither overplay nor underplay your hand. And a lot of this should be actively in your mind as you're thinking of how to formulate the claim and what kinds of qualifiers you need to insert. Most importantly, make the claim explicit. Then on to the grounds. Assuming that you're working on an empirical research article, empirical dissertation, one of the questions you have to address is, what kinds of empirical material do I use? What do I include? What do I exclude? And as you can see, and as I already mentioned, these boxes, these grounds, they're not empirical data. They're not raw data. There are inferences drawn from the data. In the case of Piketty, where he uses statistical material, mostly enumerative inductions. So again, make it clear to your audience what kinds of grounds you're using, how you're refining your data, what kinds of elementary inferences you're drawing. And then, as is often the case in empirical research, we don't have access to all the grounds that we would really like to have access to. Be transparent about this as well. Going back to the research on economic inequality, data on income are usually much easier to get access to than data on wealth. And Piketty makes this point, and so do many others who do research on economic inequality. So make sure that you have this maybe epistemic humility to say, okay, this is the data I have. This is the data I really like to have, but this is the data I have. This is part of the process of justifying the choice of grounds. The warrants are where you really hit the difficult choice situations. And let me use the wealth accumulating in an undeserved ways as an example here. Piketty maintained that there was something about executive compensation, something about the way it accrued over time that made it undeserved. CEOs don't deserve the salaries that they make. Well, how do we justify this idea that CEOs are so powerful that they can compel the board of directors to breach their fiduciary duty of loyalty and care to the corporation and essentially become the CEO's agents? Where does this assumption come from? Well, it comes from this notion of managerial hegemony theory. Imagine that Piketty sat down with a bunch of, let's say, agency theory researchers and tried to convince them of this managerial hegemony idea. I think there would be a lot of pushback. I think both institutional theorists and agency theorists would say, you know what? Yes, CEOs are powerful, but boards of directors have powers too. And they also have legal fiduciary duties. And there are many legal frameworks, regulatory frameworks that compel boards to be independent of the corporation, its shareholders, and obviously the CEO as well. So Piketty might have a tough time convincing at least some tables of this notion of managerial hegemony. Now, what would have helped us, and I think this would help Piketty's readers, if we understood the process by which he decided to pick the managerial hegemony theory instead of the comparatively more established institutional theories and agency theory. What led him to managerial hegemony? Just making it transparent, making that choice transparent. Because someone else, let's say an agency theorist that looked at the very same data and picked a different set of words, might come up with a different claim, even though they're looking at the very same data. This is why warrants are so central. And finally, this is what connects argument structure to reasoning. Once we have mapped out the entire structure, we might ask, in what way do the premises, and in the Toulmin model, you can think of the grounds and the warrants as the premises. In what way do these premises support the conclusion, which in the Toulmin model is the claim? Do the grounds and the warrants deductively imply the claim, inductively, abductively? This is where reasoning and argumentation kind of meet. And this is where we would really benefit from transparency with regard to the process by which the grounds, the warrants, the claims, and the backings were introduced. If you're going to make the case that the claim is a deductive implication of the grounds and the warrants, then you really need to introduce the grounds and the warrants first, and then see what they imply in terms of the claim. But if you already at the outset have kind of an idea of the kind of claim that you want to make based on the grounds you have, and then you start retrofitting warrants to build a bridge to the claim that you already knew that you wanted to make, that's no longer deduction. That process, I would describe it as abduction. So this is why understanding the process becomes relevant. I would invite you to take the Toulmin model and apply it to an argument that you think you know well. And see if you can learn something new about that argument in light of the analysis. Is there something that becomes clearer now that you look at its structure? And on the off chance that you either disagree or agree with the claim, does your analysis compel you to revisit your belief? And if yes, why does that happen? Let me give you a personal reflection here. This is what I like to do, and this is what I recommend to all my colleagues as well. Take a claim that you profoundly disagree with. Your visceral reaction is, oh, that's just nonsense. And then ask yourself, can I see an argument structure that actually supports the claim? Maybe, and this has happened to me more than once, after doing the analysis, I come full circle back to the claim. I say, I profoundly disagree with the claim, but I can see how the presenter of the argument got there. This is a very nice way of challenging your own predispositions and really accepting the evaluation task. Your task as a scholar is to evaluate the entire structure of the argument and not just give a show of hands, thumbs up or thumbs down on whether you agree or disagree with the claim. This is not a popularity contest. We're not counting votes. We are looking at whether the claim is credibly supported by an argument structure. That's what credible argumentation is all about. There are a total of 6 elements to the Toulmin model. I have discussed 5 so far: claim, qualifier, grounds, warrants, and backings. The final one is the rebuttal. And the role of the rebuttal in an argument is to call into question something about the argument. Now, imagine again, you're sitting around a table, you present an argument, you need to be prepared for rebuttals. And this is usually the division of tasks around the table is you present an argument and then someone else presents a rebuttal to which you may then present a rejoinder. We usually don't present rebuttals of our own work, although it would be possible. But not just any critique qualifies as a rebuttal. First of all, a rebuttal has to be an argument. We're all held to the same standard, so whether you're presenting an original argument or a rebuttal or a rejoinder, the criterion is the same. Whatever you say will be evaluated as an argument. For a counter-argument to qualify as a rebuttal, it has to explicitly call into question something essential about the original argument. And the critique of Piketty's work offers nice illustrations, examples where this did not happen. Somebody presented a counter-argument that ultimately didn't call into question anything except maybe the factual error that the person had discovered. For example, there's a brief passage in Piketty's book where he describes minimum wage in the United States. And he makes statements that are factually incorrect. What are the implications of this? Does this mean that the entire book should be dismissed because Piketty can't fact check himself? That would be a little too harsh. I think, well, yes, we might question why did Piketty not fact check himself? This is publicly available information. Why didn't he get the US minimum wage right? And this may cast some doubt on his credibility, but let's set that aside and just look at the argument. Does this factual error of the US minimum wage, does it call into question this argument? And we concluded that it doesn't. So, getting the US minimum wage wrong does not call into question anything essential about this argument. I mean, there are other arguments in Piketty where the US minimum wage might become relevant, but insofar as this argument, the divergence claim is concerned, it's an ancillary mistake. So we can kind of discard that. Now, we identified a total of 3 very well thought out rebuttals. One of these rebuttals called into question the notion that R being greater than G is a fundamental inequality. Another rebuttal called into question whether R was sufficiently greater than G. So these are 2 rebuttals aimed at the warrants. And a third rebuttal called into question the notion of wealth in increasingly concentrating wealth. As we're trying to understand rebuttals, the first thing we have to understand is what is the element at which the rebuttal is directed. It could be directed at the claim itself, its qualifiers. Indeed, Toulmin himself noted that often rebuttals are aimed at the qualifier. And I concur, they can be, but they can also be aimed at any other element. They can be aimed at the warrants or the grounds or the backings. This is all something that needs to be determined on a case-by-case basis. So this is how we make rebuttals more transparent, which may ultimately make the original argument more transparent as well. Before I discuss the 3 noteworthy rebuttals, let me just state the obvious. Rebuttal is not synonymous with rejection. There were plenty of rejections of Piketty's argument, as there were just unconditional endorsements. We just decided to ignore all of them. Anyone who unconditionally endorses or hastily rejects an argument is just not of interest to a scholarly conversation. As you're sitting around your tables and you spend more time at these tables, this
should become clear. Rebuttals they are arguments. Again, in order to qualify as a rebuttal, you have to present an explicit argument and one that explicitly calls into question an essential part of the original argument. Now, let me describe the three rebuttals that we found worthy of scholarly attention. And not surprisingly, these come from scholars themselves. So the first one is from Gregory Mankiw, who is an economics professor at Harvard. Mankiw looked at the difference between R and G. He did not challenge that R did not exceed G, but he called into question whether R exceeded G in a sufficient way. What does sufficient mean? That the gap between the two is sufficiently high to produce the kinds of adverse consequences that Piketty was concerned about. Mankiw estimated that in the state of Massachusetts in the United States, R would have to persistently exceed G by about 7 percentage points for R to be sufficiently greater than G. And he estimated that R was about 2 percentage points, not 7, greater than G. So he did not call into question Piketty's grounds, but the warrant that R was sufficiently greater than G. In another related rebuttal, Acemoglu and Robinson looked at whether the difference between R and G actually predicted concentration of wealth. And they ran a number of econometric models, and they came to the conclusion that the difference between R and G does not statistically predict concentration of wealth. So again, they did not question whether R was greater than G, but whether it was greater in a way that made a difference. So they ultimately called into question the notion that R being greater than G constitutes a fundamental inequality. Yes, it constitutes an inequality, and in fact, R is greater than G, but just like Mankiw, they said, well, but that's not a sufficient condition yet for us to be really concerned about the difference between R and G. So both rebuttals here are aimed at the warrants. Not the empirical inferences, but the warrants. And once you call into question the warrant, then that implicitly calls into question the claim, or at least the qualifiers of the claim as well. Finally, in a noteworthy rebuttal of the grounds, Otten and Splinter made the point that by focusing on tax records, Piketty effectively focused on earned income, salary income. But of course, there are other sources of income, various wealth transfers, for instance. And once we take them into account, as Otten and Splinter did in their empirical analysis, they found less compelling evidence of the increasing concentration of wealth. So, and this actually comes to this, back to the point of how difficult it is ultimately to use empirical material as a foundation for making claims about economic inequality. So the Otten and Splinter, again, they did not reject Piketty's argument, but they said there are a number of qualifications that we need to take into account when we talk about the concentration of wealth. And when our claims are based on tax records, we are effectively ignoring certain types of income. And again, none of these three are saying that economic inequality isn't a concern. The common denominator in 1, 2, and 3 is that Mankiw, Acemoglu and Robinson, and Otten and Splinter are not as concerned about the adverse consequences of economic inequality as Piketty is. So Piketty seems to see more concerns in the empirical material. But the reason he sees more concerns is because he has adopted warrants that, in a sense, give him the license to see these adverse developments. These scholars who wrote the rebuttals are not as concerned. Here's another example that Sakumantere and I discuss in our 21 article that can be used to illustrate two important issues regarding argumentation and argument structure. The first point is that rebuttals are arguments unto themselves, and they have to be held to the same methodological standard as the original argument. And then, of course, if the presenter of the original argument wants to provide a counter-argument to the rebuttal, then that rejoinder again has to be held to the same standard. So, rebuttals are arguments unto themselves. So this kind of levels the playing field. Anyone who presents arguments will be held to the same standard. This example, which I won't discuss in great detail, but let me just give you the general idea. This comes from the United States in the 1960s. There was a bicycle manufacturer called Schwinn that did something in its supply chain practices that garnered the attention of the judicial system. And this is a case that went all the way up to the Supreme Court. So this is what Schwinn was doing, which was controversial. It was telling its retailers, so companies that sold its bicycles to the general public, it told these companies, among other things, prices at which the bikes would have to be sold, and it also imposed various territorial restrictions. So it would tell a retailer, oh, you are allowed to sell these bikes only in these and these and these regions. These kinds of vertical restraints in supply chains are always a cause for concern. The concern is that very powerful actors in the supply chain are exerting power on others, and ultimately that has adverse consequences to the consumer as well. These concerns are discussed under the rubric of antitrust. So the antitrust argument, this is essentially the U.S. Supreme Court's position on the issue. In 1967, the U.S. Supreme Court concluded that evidently Schwinn had used coercion to create a monopoly position, and this kind of activity is illegal and should be punished. And indeed, this is what happened. But as anyone, you don't have to be a lawyer to know that rulings are not just about the facts, but also the interpretation of the facts. So there's something more than just the evidence at play. And that something else is a set of warrants which rest on a set of foundations or backings. The counter-argument or the rebuttal built on a very different logic. It did not deny the grounds of the antitrust argument. And in fact, the grounds were never in dispute that, yes, Schwinn had implemented vertical restraints in the supply chain. That was accepted as an empirical fact. But the author of the efficiency argument, Oliver Williamson, who is one of the pioneers of transaction cost economics, he worked at the Justice Department in the 60s, followed the Schwinn case very carefully, and simply disagreed with the Supreme Court's decision. Not because he disagreed on the facts, but he disagreed on the inferences that those facts would warrant. So his conclusion was that plausibly Schwinn was doing something completely benign. It was simply trying to improve the efficiency of transactions. So he gave a very different interpretation to the same facts. And the explanation for why this was the case can be found in the warrants and the backings that were very different from what the antitrust table had adopted. So this is essentially two different tables, if you will, discussing the same evidence, the same facts, and coming to different conclusions. So this is a nice example, I think, of how both the original argument and the rebuttal have to be held to the same standard. And also, if you look at the efficiency argument, what is it eventually rebutting? It is a rebuttal of the unconditional strong qualifier evidently in the antitrust argument. So the efficiency argument challenges the strength at which the conclusion is presented. And indeed, if we come to the conclusion that the qualifier evidently is too strong, well, then the court might feel compelled to reverse its decision, which is exactly what happened in 1977, and this was in large part affected by the emergence of the efficiency argument. So, this is an example of how original arguments and rebuttals are evaluated using the same criterion, and how for a rebuttal to qualify as a rebuttal, it has to explicitly call into question something essential about the original argument. The second point I want to make here with this example is, let's go back to my fairly provocative statement in the earlier sessions that truth is ultimately inoperational in argument evaluation. This is a good place to make that point. So if I asked you, what is the truth about the Schwinn case, for instance? Should we look at the backings in terms of truth? Well, no, those are just, different intellectual foundations, theories of industrial organization, transaction cost economics, firm-level theories of governance. They're simply ways of seeing. So they're more like social structures, intellectual structures. Well, the question, are these true or not? It just doesn't sound like a relevant question. How about the warrants? The view of the firm as a production function, is that true or not? Well, again, it seems like a misguided question. Viewing the firm as if it were a production function or a governance structure is a matter of choice. There's really no notion of truth here. How about the claim? Evidently, Schwinn used coercion to create a monopoly position. Is that true or not? Well, again, the question is not one of truth, but one of plausibility, credibility. And when we ask the question of credibility, we have to look at the structure of the entire argument. So the truth of the conclusion seems like a misguided or a borderline irrelevant question. The only place where the notion of truth may become even remotely relevant is the grounds. Schwinn implements vertical restraints in the supply chain. We might ask, is this true or not? Is this factually correct? And in the Schwinn case, there was really no quarrel on the grounds. So whether you sided with the antitrust argument or the efficiency argument, you tended to accept the grounds as true or as factual. That's the only place where truth becomes, in my view, even remotely relevant. But ultimately, what is most relevant here is understanding what the claims are, what the argument structure is that supports these claims, and then being able to understand how these two arguments relate to one another. But to me, it is painfully irrelevant to ask whether the efficiency argument is true or more true than the antitrust argument. That just doesn't seem like the relevant question to me. And now for my final reflections. Just like in the case of reasoning, the descriptive and the prescriptive criteria are central. Just like I need to understand your reasoning, I need to understand your argumentation. And argumentation has two dimensions, structure and process. The Toulmin model I have found to be very useful in making the structure of the argument transparent. But there is also the process aspect. In what order do you introduce the various elements? Where do you start and where do you end? To the extent we can make not just the structure but also the process transparent, this all caters to the advancement and the progress of our conversations. Those around the table need to understand not just the structure but hopefully also the process of my argument. And the idea that when you are presented with a claim, you often have an immediate visceral reaction to it. Oh, I agree or I disagree. Try to set your own beliefs aside. Again, to be very blunt, nobody cares about what you believe. Those around the table are interested in hearing arguments that take the conversation forward. If somebody utters a claim and you simply say, oh, for the record, I agree or disagree, nobody cares. This doesn't take the conversation forward. And for that to happen, you have to take the claim and you have to evaluate the structure of the argument that supports it. And let me here make the link between reasoning and argumentation. Think of reasoning as the way your premises link to your conclusions. Does it happen in a deductive, inductive, or an abductive manner? But when we speak of argumentation, argumentation involves reasoning, linking premises to conclusions, but it also involves questions such as what premises should I include and which should I exclude? And what are the different kinds of premises that I have? If you think of the Toulmin model, you can think of the grounds and the warrants as the premises and the claim as the conclusion. And now to understand the diversity of our premises, we have empirical premises, the grounds, and then we have various assumptions, preconditions, and rules and principles that we apply as premises as we are bridging those grounds to the claim. So this is where reasoning meets argumentation. Reasoning helps you link the boxes to one another, whereas argumentation compels you to think of which boxes are relevant in the first place. And for the conversation to move forward, we need rebuttals. And again, rebuttals are not the same as rejections. Skilled rebuttals look at the original argument in its entirety, not just the claim, and they critically examine the different parts. And then if the person presenting the rebuttal is able to explicitly question one of the central elements of the original argument, then the counter-argument counts as a rebuttal. It can be aimed at the claim or its qualifiers, but it can also be aimed at the warrants or the grounds, as we saw in the Piketty example. One of the things that we discovered as we were going through numerous evaluations of Piketty, both positive and negative, we found that those who disagreed with Piketty seemed to be more compelled to be explicit about why they disagreed, whereas those who agreed were less compelled to do so. And I'm wondering where this asymmetry comes from. Why do we have a stricter standard in case you disagree, but if you agree, then a mere show of hands is sufficient? And indeed, I read many endorsements of Piketty 2014 that didn't really exhibit that the person had actually read Piketty's argument and the book. The endorsement took place at a very general level, but didn't go into the specifics. And to me, this is the first indication that the person who agrees with the argument hasn't really taken a very good look at it. This was true with some of the rebuttals as well. In the 700-page book, somebody had identified on page 272 a factual mistake and then used that as a gotcha moment of some kind to reject the book in its entirety. Well, this really isn't compelling. Yes, if there's a flaw, we might ask, why is this a flaw? If it's a factually incorrect statement, we might ask, why didn't the person fact check themselves? But just based on identifying one error or one flaw, it is unreasonable to reject the argument in its entirety. Again, would you like those who evaluate your work to take that kind of a skeptical attitude? If they find a single flaw in your argument, they will outright dismiss the entire argument. My guess is that you would not want those who evaluate your argument to be this harsh. And if all those are sitting around the table adopted the same skeptical attitude and behavior, what are the chances that the conversation will progress? We should feel compelled to apply the exact same standard to the original argument, to the rebuttal, to potential rejoinders, and to anyone who agrees or disagrees with the argument. If you agree, be explicit about how and why and which specifics do you agree with. You can't possibly agree with everything. And the same obviously goes with disagreement. Always be explicit about disagreement, be explicit about the rebuttal, and then show that what you identify as a cause for concern actually calls into question the argument that was presented. And at the end of this conversation, we may realize that the rebuttal didn't really reject the original argument. It simply contextualized it or qualified it in one way or another. And this, again, takes the conversation forward. This concludes session 3 presentation, How Do I Structure My Argument?